Hello everybody and welcome to this series of me building my 32 Ford Roadster. In this video we're going to cover engines. First we need to talk about engines themselves. Now you have plenty of options when it comes to hot rods. Starting with the most traditional, you have your original 4-banger, came with your Model A's. Then on 32, Ford introduced the flathead. These were revolutionary to the hot rod world and were often transplanted or swapped into Model A's, hence AV8. Now, those are definitely the most traditional approach. As you get later along the timeline, more towards modern or towards the 60s, you have three motors that are kind of iconic and a little bit more traditional than a small block Chevy. That's going to be your Buick Nailhead, your Olds Rocket, and your Cadillac V8. Then, of course, the staple, what everybody does more than likely, is a small block Chevy. For those Ford diehards, those anti-Chevy guys, it's not that crazy to see a small block Ford either. Now, from there on, now you're into the 60s. Big block Chevys, big block Fords, and of course, the biggest of them all, kind of the coolest swap, in my opinion, would be the Hemi. So, now that you have all the engines kind of listed out for you and you can look at the options, let's get into the things you need to know that might hinder what type of engine you end up going for your build. Now, ultimately, there's a huge debate on what's the best motor or what's a hot rod motor. Forget about all that. Don't waste your time. The best motor is pretty much what fits your style, but most importantly, what fits your budget. Now, here are some things that are also going to help that budget, because you don't just have to consider the engine cost, you also have to consider the modifications that it requires to fit in whatever hot rod you're building. Now, of course, not only is everybody's hot rod going to be different, however, your situation might be different. Maybe you started your hot rod build by getting a body and a firewall. Well, that firewall is going to determine what type of motor you're going to be able to run, at least without modifying it. For example, if you have a stock 32 firewall, you're not going to be able to fit a small block Chevy unless you shove that motor forward. In order to fit it using that stock firewall, you have to recess your firewall back or get a flat firewall like I have from Brookville. So depending on your situation, that can be one of the things that determine what type of engine you're going to want to go with. So now, hopefully you narrow down what type of engine you want to run. Also, you've kind of confirmed what type of firewall you need to run. Those are the bigger things. Now it's time to look at the smaller details and how that's going to affect not only your motor, but the way you're going to mount it in the future. For example, on my small block Chevy, I really wanted to run a Hearst style mount. It's kind of sneaky because if you run that Hearst style mount, you can't run a mechanical fuel pump. That means you're going to need an electric fuel pump or an in-gas tank fuel pump in the future. Also, I'm running a Zips water pump riser with a V6 pump. A stock small block Chevy puts the fan really low, doesn't make your radiator as effective as raising it with the Zips water pump riser. However, you run that water pump riser, you're also limited to where you can put your alternator. I didn't really want to run mine, although I think it does look cool, outside of the header or the manifold, so I end up using the actual Zips mount. So again, now that you know what kind of motors, you can Google those motors and see how they run not only their accessories, their belt drive accessories, but their exhaust. And those are the things you kind of need to consider in order to really narrow down your motor. Now that you have the big things, the small things, let's talk about motor mounts and transmission mounts, because those work together. So let's take a break from the motor and let's talk about the transmission. Now, no matter what type of transmission you're running, let's say every mount's going to be a little bit different. On a flathead, on an original 32 K-member, that bolts right to the K-member. However, your situation might need to be a little more custom than that. But don't worry, because pretty much transmission mounts are pretty universal. There's plenty of options out there. The key thing to consider when picking your transmission mount is just make sure that it gives you enough adjustment, because your transmission mount is what pretty much determines your engine angle, pointing usually 3 degrees down. So now you know that, let's move back to the engine. Now, no matter what type of motor you're running, you're going to kind of see a lot of motors using this style of motor mount system. Whether it's a flathead, small block Chevy, or a Hemi, this is kind of the most universal and also kind of the easiest way to hold the front of your motor. Reason being, especially with the Hurst style mount, you leave a lot of space open on the other side for your steering box, a lot of space open for any future actual exhaust work, your bar coming through. It's kind of the easiest solution. However, you can use these same style of chassis mounts with the traditional actual block mounts as well. Now, there's a lot of other options out there. The biggest ones are also going to determine your height. If you're building more of a custom, something lower to the ground, you really want to get your oil pan up higher, these mounts would be built up quite a bit. So take a time and look at other ways that people are mounting their motors. But more than likely, on a good basic hot rod build, you're going to be using this style system. So now you have a good idea of the motor, the firewall, all your accessories, and your mounts. It's time to actually begin the mock-up process. Now for mock-up, one of the things that's going to make your life a lot easier is if you have an empty transmission case and a foam block that whatever motor you're going to be running, right? And when I say empty transmission case, is you can also use the foam version, but an empty transmission case is just as light and easy for mock-up, and those are readily available. Go down to your local transmission shop and get yourself an empty case with a broken tab or something that they won't use. You can usually get those pretty cheap. When it comes to the foam block, same thing. They're not really inexpensive by any means. Go down to your local hot rod shop or speed shop. They'll have them. If you ask nice enough, most of them will actually loan it to you. Go in there on a Friday, put down a $500 deposit, which is the value. Go back on a Monday, return it, and get your deposit back. But don't forget that when you get all that stuff, you also need your critical components. Your distributor, your water pump, your pulley, and your fan, because that's going to come up when setting up your motor. So now that you have those quick tips, let's get into the actual mock-up process. Now the easiest thing to do, or the first part of the mock-up process, is centering your motor. 99.9% of the time, the center line of your motor is going to be right on top of the center line of your chassis. When setting up your engine, that's the first thing you're going to want to do. Now let's talk about engine height. Now in most cases, whatever cross member you're using, the center cross member and your transmission mount and your normal transmission mount up front are going to put your engine at a pretty good height. However, there are certain circumstances, and you also do have some ability to raise the motor up and down. Generally speaking, what you want to do is make sure that your oil pan, whether that's your transmission or your actual motor oil pan, is never below your front axle. That front axle is going to be one of the critical things that's going to protect your oil pan in a bad situation. The other way that you're going to be able to adjust your motor, or something to consider, is your transmission tunnel height in the future. Obviously, the higher your transmission goes, the bigger that tunnel is going to be. The lower, the smaller. But again, you don't want to shove this all the way to the ground and expose your oil pan. So that's the balance. You also want to consider if you're going to be running a nice supercharger or something cool like that, to make sure you don't go above your hood line, unless that's the look you're going for. So when it comes to height, start at the basic setup, but just keep in mind your transmission tunnel is going to be affected. Make sure your oil pan is protected. And make sure you don't go too high as well. So we talked about centering the motor, talked about height. Now we got to talk about front to back. Now really the key thing here is to think about the future accessibility of your motor and the maintenance. Once you have your firewall in place, or at least you know where your firewall limit's going to be, make sure you're comfortable enough to get your hand behind your distributor. This is also going to leave you enough room for your future spark plug wires. But it's also a balancing act for the front. I actually pushed my radiator a little bit forward, then brought my grill shell back in order to give myself about an extra half of an inch of space in order to access my fan bolts and do any maintenance that I might need to do there without removing my radiator. So the next thing and the last thing we have to talk about is motor angle. Now you're going to want to lean your motor back anywhere from 1 to 5 degrees, 3 being your average. Pretty much never are you going to want to run your motor level, and we're going to get to a reason why here in a second. But one of the key things that I want to mention to you is to never use any surface on your intake, whether that's the top of your air filter, your carburetor mount, or the intake itself, because intakes are actually designed to be level when the motor's leaned back. Make sure you use your valve cover if it's flat, or maybe your head, or something else when referencing your angle. So now, what do you do? Do you go 1 degree, 5 degrees? Let's talk about the drive shaft because that's where you're going to discover your angle. Now, when it comes to your motor angle, what's going to kind of determine those 2 to 3 degrees is going to be your pinion angle of 2 to 3 degrees. It's ideal for your pinion angle to match your motor angle. In most instances, that is possible. However, one thing you definitely don't want to do is try to go for a perfectly in-line type of drive line. Reason being is because then your bearings aren't doing any work. When they're offset at the same degrees, that's what's actually causing your universals to work and that grease to travel inside your bearings. So don't think that your drive shaft needs to be in a perfect line. You're not going to get any weird vibrations or anything like that. The key thing that I want to tell you is match your pinion angle if you can. Up next, we're going to talk about exhaust, fuel system, and we'll just keep the build going. I hope this video gives you the good fundamental things that you need to know in order to start researching your future hot rod engine. Now, with that, I want to thank you guys so much for your time, and we'll see you in the next one.